It was already dusk when Gregor awoke from his deep, coma-like sleep. Even if he had not been disturbed, he would certainly not have woken up much later, for he felt that he had rested and slept long enough. But it seemed to him that a hurried step and a cautious shutting of the door leading to the foyer had awakened him. The light of the electric street lamps lay in pallid streaks on the ceiling and on the upper parts of the furniture, but underneath, where Gregor was, it was dark. Groping clumsily with his antennae, which he was only now beginning to appreciate, he slowly dragged himself towards the door to see what had been happening there. His left side felt like one single, long, unpleasantly tautening scar, and he actually had to limp on his 2 rows of legs. Besides, one little leg had been seriously injured in the course of the morning's events. It was almost a miracle that only one had been injured and dragged along lifelessly. Only after he got to the door did he notice what had really attracted him, the smell of something to eat. For there stood a bowl filled with fresh milk in which small slices of white bread were floating. He could almost have laughed for joy, since he was even hungrier than he had been in the morning, and he immediately dipped his head into the milk, almost to over his eyes. But he soon drew it back again in disappointment, not only because he had difficulty eating on account of the soreness in his left side, and he could eat only if his whole panting body cooperated, but because he didn't like the milk at all, although it used to be his favorite drink, and that was certainly why his sister had put it in the room. In fact, he turned away from the bowl almost with repulsion and crawled back to the middle of the room. In the living room, as Gregor saw through the crack in the door, the gas had been lit, but while at this hour of the day his father was in the habit of reading the afternoon newspaper in a loud voice to his mother, and sometimes to his sister too. Now there wasn't a sound. Well, perhaps this custom of reading aloud, which his sister was always telling him and writing him about, had recently been discontinued altogether. But in all the other rooms too, it was just as still, although the apartment certainly was not empty. What a quiet life the family has been leading, Gregor said to himself, and while he stared rigidly in front of him into the darkness, he felt very proud that he had been able to provide such a life and so nice an apartment for his parents and his sister. But what now if all the peace, the comfort, the contentment were to come to a horrible end? In order not to get involved in such thoughts, Gregor decided to keep moving, and he crawled up and down the room. During the long evening, first one of the side doors and then the other was opened a small crack and quickly shut again. Someone had probably had the urge to come in and then had had second thoughts. Gregor now settled into position right by the living room door, determined somehow to get the hesitating visitor to come in, or at least to find out who it might be. But the door was not opened again, and Gregor waited in vain. In the morning, when the doors had been locked, everyone had wanted to come in. Now that he had opened one of the doors and the others had evidently been opened during the day, no one came in, and now the keys were even inserted on the outside. It was late at night when the light finally went out in the living room, and now it was easy for Gregor to tell that his parents and his sister had stayed up so long since, as he could distinctly hear, all 3 were now retiring on tiptoe. Certainly, no one would come in to Gregor until the morning, and so he had ample time to consider undisturbed how best to rearrange his life. But the empty, high-ceilinged room in which he was forced to lie flat on the floor made him nervous, without his being able to tell why, since it was, after all, the room in which he had lived for the past 5 years. And turning half unconsciously and not without a slight feeling of shame, he scuttled under the couch where, although his back was a little crushed and he could not raise his head anymore, he immediately felt very comfortable and was only sorry that his body was too wide to go completely under the couch. There he stayed the whole night, which he spent partly in a sleepy trance from which hunger pangs kept waking him with a start, partly in worries and vague hopes, all of which, however, led to the conclusion that for the time being he would have to lie low and by being patient and showing his family every possible consideration, help them bear the inconvenience which he simply had to cause them in his present condition. Early in the morning, it was still almost night. Gregor had the opportunity of testing the strength of the resolutions he had just made, for his sister, almost fully dressed, opened the door from the foyer and looked in eagerly. She did not see him right away, but when she caught sight of him under the couch, God, he had to be somewhere. He couldn't just fly away. She became so frightened that she lost control of herself and slammed the door shut again. But, as if she felt sorry for her behavior, she immediately opened the door again and came in on tiptoe, as if she were visiting someone seriously ill or perhaps even a stranger. Gregor had pushed his head forward just to the edge of the couch and was watching her. Would she notice that he had left the milk standing, and not because he hadn't been hungry? And would she bring in a dish of something he'd like better? If she were not going to do it of her own free will, he would rather starve than call it to her attention. Although, really, he felt an enormous urge to shoot out from under the couch, throw himself at his sister's feet, and beg for something good to eat. But his sister noticed at once, to her astonishment, that the bowl was still full. Only a little milk was spilled around it. She picked it up immediately, not with her bare hands, of course, but with a rag, and carried it out. Gregor was extremely curious to know what she would bring him instead, and he racked his brains on the subject. But he would never have been able to guess what his sister, in the goodness of her heart, actually did. To find out his likes and dislikes, she brought him a wide assortment of things, all spread out on an old newspaper. Old, half-rotten vegetables, bones left over from the evening meal, caked with congealed white sauce, some raisins and almonds, a piece of cheese, which 2 days before Gregor had almost declared inedible, a plain slice of bread, a slice of bread and butter, and one with butter and salt. In addition to all this, she put down some water in the bowl, apparently permanently earmarked for Gregor's use, and out of a sense of delicacy, since she knew that Gregor would not eat in front of her, she left hurriedly and even turned the key, just so that Gregor should know that he might make himself as comfortable as he wanted. Gregor's legs began whirring now that he was going to eat. Besides, his bruises must have completely healed, since he no longer felt any handicap, and marveling at this, he thought how, over a month ago, he had cut his finger very slightly with a knife, and how this wound was still hurting him only the day before yesterday. Have I become less sensitive, he thought, already sucking greedily at the cheese, which had immediately and forcibly attracted him ahead of all the other dishes. One right after the other, and with eyes streaming with tears of contentment, he devoured the cheese, the vegetables, and the sauce. The fresh foods, on the other hand, he did not care for. He couldn't even stand their smell, and even dragged the things he wanted to eat a bit farther away. He had finished with everything long since and was just lying lazily up the same spot when his sister slowly turned the key as a sign for him to withdraw. That immediately startled him, although he was almost asleep, and he scuttled under the couch again. But it took great self-control for him to stay under the couch, even for the short time his sister was in the room, since his body had become a little bloated from the heavy meal, and in his cramped position he could hardly breathe. In between slight attacks of suffocation, he watched with bulging eyes as his unsuspecting sister took a broom and swept up not only his leavings, but even the foods which Gregor had left completely untouched, as if they too were no longer usable, and dumping everything hastily into a pail, which she covered with a wooden lid, she carried everything out. She had hardly turned her back when Gregor came out from under the couch, stretching and puffing himself up. This, then, was the way Gregor was fed each day. Once in the morning, when his parents and the maid were still asleep, and a second time in the afternoon after everyone had had dinner, and then his parents took a short nap again, and the maid could be sent out by his sister on some errand. Certainly they did not want him to starve either, but perhaps they would not have been able to stand knowing any more about his meals than from hearsay, or perhaps his sister wanted to spare them even what was possibly only a minor torment, for really, They were suffering enough as it was. Gregor could not find out what excuses had been made to get rid of the doctor and the locksmith on that first morning, for since the others could not understand what he had said, it didn't occur to any of them, not even to his sister, that he could understand what they said, and so he had to be satisfied when his sister was in the room, with only occasionally hearing her sighs and appeals to the saints. It was only later, when she'd begun to get used to everything, there could never, of course, be any question of a complete adjustment, that Gregor sometimes caught a remark which was meant to be friendly, or could be interpreted as such. "Oh, he liked what he had today," she would say when Gregor had tucked away a good helping, and in the opposite case, which gradually occurred more and more frequently, she used to say, almost sadly, "He's left everything again." But if Gregor could not get any news directly, he overheard a great deal from the neighboring rooms, and as soon as he heard voices, he would immediately run to the door concerned and press his whole body against it. Especially in the early days, there was no conversation that was not somehow about him, if only implicitly. For 2 whole days, there were family consultations at every mealtime about how they should cope. This was also the topic of discussion between meals, for at least 2 members of the family were always at home, since no one probably wanted to stay home alone, and it was impossible to leave the apartment completely empty. Besides, on the very first day, the maid, it was not completely clear what and how much she knew of what had happened, had begged his mother on bended knees to dismiss her immediately. And when she said goodbye a quarter of an hour later, she thanked them in tears for the dismissal, as if for the greatest favor that had ever been done to her in this house, and made a solemn vow, without anyone asking her for it, not to give anything away to anyone. Now his sister, working with her mother, had to do the cooking too. Of course, that didn't cause much trouble since they hardly ate anything. Gregor was always hearing one of them pleading in vain with one of the others to eat and getting no answer except, "Thanks, I've had enough," or something similar. They did not seem to drink anything either. His sister often asked her father if he wanted any beer and gladly offered to go out for it herself. And when he did not answer, she said, in order to remove any hesitation on his part, that she could also send the janitor's wife to get it. But then his father finally answered with a definite no, and that was the end of that. In the course of the very first day, his father explained the family's financial situation and prospects to both the mother and the sister. From time to time, he got up from the table to get some kind of receipt or notebook out of the little strongbox he had rescued from the collapse of his business 5 years before. Gregor heard him open the complicated lock and secure it again after taking out what he'd been looking for. These explanations by his father were to some extent the first pleasant news Gregor had heard since his imprisonment. He'd always believed that his father had not been able to save a penny from the business. At least his father had never told him anything to the contrary. And Gregor, for his part, had never asked him any questions. In those days, Gregor's sole concern had been to do everything in his power to make the family forget as quickly as possible the business disaster which had plunged everyone into a state of total despair. And so he had begun to work with special ardor and had risen almost overnight from stock clerk to traveling salesman, which of course had opened up very different money-making possibilities, and in no time his successes on the job were transformed by means of commission into hard cash that could be plunked down on the table at home in front of his astonished and delighted family. Those had been wonderful times, and they'd never returned. At least not with the same glory, although later on, Gregor earned enough money to meet the expenses of the entire family, and actually did so. They had just gotten used to it, the family as well as Gregor. The money was received with thanks and given with pleasure, but no special feeling of warmth went with it anymore. Only his sister had remained close to Gregor, and it was his secret plan that she who, unlike him, loved music and could play the violin movingly, should be sent next year to the conservatory, regardless of the great expense involved, which could surely be made up for in some other way. Often during Gregor's short stays in the city, the conservatory would come up in his conversations with his sister, but always merely as a beautiful dream which was not supposed to come true. And his parents were not happy to hear even those innocent allusions, but Gregor had very concrete ideas on the subject, and he intended solemnly to announce his plan on Christmas Eve. Thoughts like these, completely useless in his present state, went through his head as he stood glued to the door, listening. Sometimes out of general exhaustion, he could not listen anymore and let his head bump carelessly against the door, but immediately pulled it back again. For even the slight noise he made by doing this had been heard in the next room and made them all lapse into silence. "What's he carrying on about in there now?" said his father after a while, obviously turning towards the door, and only then would the interrupted conversation gradually be resumed. Gregor now learned in a thorough way, for his father was in the habit of often repeating himself in his explanations, partly because he himself had not dealt with these matters for a long time, partly too because his mother did not understand everything the first time around, that in spite of all their misfortunes, a bit of capital, a very little bit, certainly was still intact from the old days, which in the meantime had increased a little through the untouched interest. But besides that, the money Gregor had brought home every month, he had kept only a few dollars for himself, had never been completely used up, and had accumulated into a tidy principal. Behind his door, Gregor nodded emphatically, delighted at this unexpected foresight and thrift. Of course, he actually could have paid off more of his father's debt to the boss with this extra money, and the day on which he could have gotten rid of his job would have been much closer, but now things were undoubtedly better the way his father had arranged them. Now, this money was by no means enough to let the family live off the interest. The principal was perhaps enough to support the family for 1 year, or at the most 2, but that was all there was. So it was just a sum that really should not be touched and that had to be put away for a rainy day. But the money to live on would have to be earned. Now, his father was still healthy, certainly, but he was an old man who had not worked for the past 5 years and who, in any case, could not be expected to undertake too much. During these 5 years, which were the first vacation of his hard-working yet unsuccessful life, he had gained a lot of weight and as a result had become fairly sluggish. And was his old mother now supposed to go out and earn money when she suffered from asthma, when a walk through the apartment was already an ordeal for her, and when she spent every other day lying on the sofa under the open window, gasping for breath? And was his sister now supposed to work, who for all her 17 years was still a child, and whom it would be such a pity to deprive of the life she had led until now, which had consisted of wearing pretty clothes, sleeping late, helping in the house, enjoying a few modest amusements, and above all, playing the violin? At first, whenever the conversation turned to the necessity of earning money, Gregor would let go of the door and throw himself down on the cool leather sofa which stood beside it, for he felt hot with shame and grief. Often he lay there the whole long night through, not sleeping a wink and only scrabbling on the leather for hours on end. Or not balking at the huge effort of pushing an armchair to the window. He would crawl up to the windowsill and, propped up in the chair, lean against the window, evidently in some sort of remembrance of the feeling of freedom he used to have from looking out the window. For in fact, from day to day, he saw things even a short distance away, less and less distinctly. The hospital opposite, which he used to curse because he saw so much of it, was now completely beyond his range of vision, and if he had not been positive that he was living in Charlotte Street, a quiet but still very much a city street, he might have believed that he was looking out his window into a desert where the grey sky and the grey earth were indistinguishably fused. It took his observant sister only twice to notice that his armchair was standing by the window, for her to push the chair back to the same place by the window each time she had finished cleaning the room. And from then on, she even left the inside casement of the window open. If Gregor had only been able to speak to his sister and thank her for everything she had to do for him, he could have accepted her services more easily. As it was, they caused him pain. Of course, his sister tried to ease the embarrassment of the whole situation as much as possible, and as time went on, she naturally managed it better and better. But in time, Gregor, also saw things much more clearly. Even the way she came in was terrible for him. Hardly had she entered the room than she would run straight to the window without taking the time to close the door. Though she was usually so careful to spare everyone the sight of Gregor's room, then tear open the casement with eager hands, almost as if she was suffocating, and remain for a little while at the window, even in the coldest weather, breathing deeply. With this racing and crashing, she frightened Gregor twice a day. The whole time he cowered under the couch, and yet he knew very well that she would certainly have spared him this if only she had found it possible to stand being in a room with him with the window closed. One time, it must have been a month since Gregor's metamorphosis, and there was certainly no particular reason anymore for his sister to be astonished at Gregor's appearance, she came a little earlier than usual and caught Gregor still looking out the window, immobile, and so in an excellent position to be terrifying. It would not have surprised Gregor if she had not come in, because his position prevented her from immediately opening the window. But not only did she not come in, she even sprang back and locked the door. A stranger might easily have thought that Gregor had been lying in wait for her, wanting to bite her. Of course, Gregor immediately hid under the couch, but he had to wait until noon before his sister came in again, and she seemed much more uneasy than usual. He realized from this that the sight of him was still repulsive to her, and was bound to remain repulsive to her in the future, and that she probably had to overcome a lot of resistance not to run away at the sight or even the small part of his body that jutted out from under the couch. So to spare her even this sight, one day he carried the sheet on his back to the couch. The job took 4 hours, and arranged it in such a way that he was now completely covered up, and his sister could not see him even when she stooped. If she had considered the sheet unnecessary, then of course she would have removed it, for it was clear enough that it could not be for his own pleasure that Gregor shut himself off altogether. But she left the sheet the way it was, and Gregor thought that he had even caught a grateful look when one time he cautiously lifted the sheet a little with his head in order to see how his sister was taking the new arrangement. During the first 2 weeks, his parents could not bring themselves to come into him, and often he heard them saying just how much they appreciated his sister's work, whereas until now, they had frequently been annoyed with her because she had struck them as being a little useless. But now both of them, his father and his mother, often waited outside Gregor's room while his sister straightened it up, and as soon as she came out, she had to tell them in great detail how the room looked, what Gregor had eaten, how he had behaved this time, and whether he had perhaps shown a little improvement. His mother, incidentally, began relatively soon to want to visit Gregor, but his father and his sister at first held her back with reasonable arguments to which Gregor listened very attentively, and of which he wholeheartedly approved. But later, she had to be restrained by force, and then when she cried out, "Let me go to Gregor, he is my unfortunate boy. Don't you understand that I have to go to him?" Gregor thought that it might be a good idea after all if his mother did come in. Not every day, of course, but perhaps once a week. She could still do everything much better than his sister, who, for all her courage, was still only a child, and in the final analysis, had perhaps taken on such a difficult assignment only out of childish flightiness. Gregor's desire to see his mother was soon fulfilled. During the day, Gregor did not want to show himself at the window, if only out of consideration for his parents, but he couldn't crawl very far on his few square yards of floor space either. He could hardly put up with just lying still even at night. Eating soon stopped giving him the slightest pleasure, so, as a distraction, he adopted the habit of crawling crisscross over the walls and the ceiling. He especially liked hanging from the ceiling. It was completely different from lying on the floor. One could breathe more freely. A faint swinging sensation went through the body, and in the almost happy absent-mindedness which Gregor felt up there, it could happen to his own surprise that he could let go and plopped onto the floor. But now, of course, he had much better control of his body than before, and did not hurt himself even from such a big drop. His sister immediately noticed the new entertainment Gregor had discovered for himself. After all, he left behind traces of sticky substances wherever he crawled, and so she got it into her head to make it possible for Gregor to crawl on an altogether wider scale by taking out the furniture which stood in his way, mainly the chest of drawers and the desk. But she was not able to do this by herself. She did not dare ask her father for help. The maid would certainly not have helped her, for although this girl, who was about 16, was bravely sticking it out after the previous cook had left, she had asked for the favor of locking herself in the kitchen at all times and of only opening the door on special request. So there was nothing left for his sister to do except to get her mother one day when her father was out. And his mother did come, with exclamations of excited joy, but she grew silent at the door of Gregor's room. First his sister looked to see, of course, that everything in the room was in order. Only then did she let her mother come in. Hurrying as fast as he could, Gregor had pulled the sheet down lower still and pleated it more tightly. It really looked just like a sheet accidentally thrown over the couch. This time, Gregor also refrained from spying from under the sheet. He renounced seeing his mother for the time being and was simply happy that she had come after all. "Come on, you can't see him," his sister said, evidently leading her mother in by the hand. Now Gregor could hear the two frail women moving the old chest of drawers, heavy for anyone, from its place, and his sister insisting on doing the harder part of the job herself, ignoring the warnings of her mother, who was afraid that she would overexert herself. It went on for a long time. After struggling for a good quarter of an hour, his mother said that they'd better leave the chest where it was, because in the first place, it was too heavy. They would not finish before his father came, and with the chest in the middle of the room, Gregor would be completely barricaded. And in the second place, it was not at all certain that they were doing Gregor a favor by removing his furniture. To her, the opposite seemed to be the case. The sight of the bare wall was heartbreaking. And why shouldn't Gregor also have the same feeling, since he had been used to his furniture for so long and would feel abandoned in the empty room? "And doesn't it look?" his mother concluded very softly. In fact, she'd been almost whispering the whole time, as if she wanted to avoid letting Gregor, whose exact whereabouts she did not know, hear even the sound of her voice, for she was convinced that he did not understand the words. "And doesn't it look as if by removing his furniture, we were showing him that we have given up all hopes of his getting better and are leaving him to his own devices without any consideration? I think the best thing would be to try to keep the room exactly the way it was before, so that when Gregor comes back to us again, he'll find everything unchanged and can forget all the more easily what's happened in the meantime." When he heard his mother's words, Gregor realized the monotony of family life, combined with the fact that not a soul had addressed a word directly to him, must have addled his brain in the course of the past 2 months, for he could not explain to himself in any other way how in all seriousness he could have been anxious to have his room cleared out. Had he really wanted to have his warm room, comfortably fitted with furniture that had always been in the family, changed into a cave, in which, of course, he'd be able to crawl around unhampered in all directions, but at the cost of simultaneously, rapidly, and totally forgetting his human past? Even now he had been on the verge of forgetting, and only his mother's voice, which he had not heard for so long, had shaken him up. Nothing should be removed. Everything had to stay. He could not do without the beneficial influence of the furniture on his state of mind. And if the furniture prevented him from carrying on this senseless crawling around, then that was no loss, but rather a great advantage. But his sister, unfortunately, had a different opinion. She had become accustomed, certainly not entirely without justification, to adopt with her parents the role of the particularly well-qualified expert whenever Gregor's affairs were being discussed. And so her mother's advice was now sufficient reason for her to insist, not only on the removal of the chest of drawers and the desk, which was all she had been planning at first, but also on the removal of all the furniture, with the exception of the indispensable couch. Of course, it was not only childish defiance and the self-confidence she had recently acquired so unexpectedly and at such a cost that led her to make this demand. She had in fact noticed that Gregor needed plenty of room to crawl around in. And on the other hand, as best as she could tell, he never used the furniture at all. Perhaps, however, the romantic enthusiasm of girls her age, which seeks to indulge itself at every opportunity, played a part by tempting her to make Gregor's situation even more terrifying in order that she might do even more for him. Into a room in which Gregor ruled the bare walls all alone, no human being besides Gret was ever likely to set foot. And so she did not let herself be swerved from her decision by her mother, who, besides from the sheer anxiety of being in Gregor's room, seemed unsure of herself, soon grew silent and helped her daughter as best as she could to get the chest of drawers out the room. Well, in a pinch, Gregor could do without the chest, but the desk had to stay. And hardly had the woman left the room with the chest, squeezing against it and groaning, then Gregor stuck his head out from under the couch to see how he could feel his way into the situation as considerately as possible. But unfortunately, it had to be his mother who came back first, while in the next room, Gret was clasping the chest and rocking it back and forth by herself, without, of course, budging it from the spot. His mother was not used to the sight of Gregor. He could have made her ill, and so Gregor, frightened, scuttled in reverse to the far end of the couch, but could not stop the sheet from shifting a little at the front. That was enough to put his mother on alert. She stopped, stood still for a moment, and then went back to Gret. Although Gregor told himself over and over again that nothing special was happening, only a few pieces of furniture were being moved, he soon had to admit that this coming and going of the women, their little calls to each other, the scraping of the furniture along the floor, had the effect on him of a great turmoil swelling on all sides, and as much as he tucked in his head and his legs and shrank until his belly touched the floor, he was forced to admit that he would not be able to stand it much longer. They were clearing out his room, depriving him of everything that he loved. They had already carried away the chest of drawers in which he kept the fret saw and other tools, were now budging the desk firmly embedded in the floor. The desk he had done his homework on when he was a student at business school. In high school, yes, even in public school. Now he really had more time to examine the good intentions of the two women whose existence, besides, he had almost forgotten, for they were so exhausted that they were working in silence, and one could only hear the heavy shuffling of their feet. And so he broke out. The women were just leaning against the desk in the next room to catch their breath for a minute. Changed his course 4 times. He really didn't know what to salvage first. Then he saw hanging conspicuously on the wall, which was otherwise bare already, the picture of the lady all dressed in furs, hurriedly crawled up on it and pressed himself against the glass, which gave a good surface to stick to and soothed his hot belly. At least no one would take away this picture. While Gregor completely covered it up, he turned his head towards the living room to watch the women when they returned. They had not given themselves much of a rest, and were already coming back. Gret had put her arm around her mother and was practically carrying her. "So what should we take now?" said Gret, and looked around. At that, her eyes met Gregor's as he clung to the wall. Probably only because of her mother's presence, she kept her self-control, bent her head down to her mother to keep her from looking around, and said, though in a quavering and thoughtless voice, "Come, we'd better go back into the living room for a minute." Gret's intent was clear to Gregor. She wanted to bring his mother into safety and then chase him down from the wall. Well, just let her try. He squatted on this picture and would not give it up. He would rather fly in Gret's face. But Gret's words had now made her mother really anxious. She stepped to one side, caught sight of the gigantic brown blotch on the flowered wallpaper, and before it really dawned on her that what she saw was Gregor, cried in a hoarse, bawling voice, "Oh God! Oh God!" And as if giving up completely, she fell with outstretched arms across the couch and did not stir. "You! Gregor! cried his sister with raised fist and piercing eyes. These were the first words she had addressed directly to him since his metamorphosis. She ran into the next room to get some kind of spirits to revive her mother. Gregor wanted to help too. There was time to rescue the picture, but he was stuck to the glass and had to tear himself loose by force. Then he too ran into the next room as if he could give his sister some sort of advice, as in the old days, but then had to stand behind her doing nothing while she rummaged among various little bottles. Moreover, when she turned around, she was startled. A bottle fell on the floor and broke. A splinter of glass wounded Gregor in the face. Some kind of corrosive medicine flowed around him. Now, without waiting any longer, Gret grabbed as many little bottles as she could carry and ran with them inside to her mother. She slammed the door behind her with her foot. Now Gregor was cut off from his mother, who was perhaps near death through his fault. He could not dare open the door if he didn't want to chase away his sister, who had to stay with his mother. Now there was nothing for him to do except wait, and tormented by self-reproaches and worry, he began to crawled over everything, walls, furniture, and ceiling, and finally, in desperation, as the whole room was beginning to spin, fell down onto the middle of the table. A short time passed. Gregor lay there prostrate. All around, things were quiet. Perhaps that was a good sign. Then the doorbell rang. The maid, of course, was locked up in her kitchen, and so Greg had to answer the door. His father had come home. "What's happened?" were his first words. Gret's appearance must have told him everything. Gret answered in a muffled voice. Her face was obviously pressed against her father's chest. "Mother fainted, but she's better now. Gregor's broken out." "I knew it," his father said. "I kept telling you, but you women don't want to listen." It was clear to Gregor that his father had put the worst interpretation on Gret's all too brief announcement and assumed that Gregor was guilty of some outrage. Therefore, Gregor now had to try to calm his father down, since he had neither the time nor the ability to enlighten him. And so he fled to the door of his room and pressed himself against it for his father to see, as soon as he came into the foyer, that Gregor had the best intentions of returning to his room immediately, and that it was not necessary to drive him back. If only the door were open for him, he would disappear at once. But his father was in no mood to notice such subtleties. "Ah," he cried as he entered, in a tone that sounded as if he were at once furious and glad. Gregor turned his head away from the door and lifted it towards his father. He had not really imagined his father looking like this. As he stood in front of him now, admittedly, Gregor had been too absorbed recently in his newfangled crawling to bother as much as before about events in the rest of the house, and should really have been prepared to find some changes. And yet, was this still his father? Was this the same man who in the old days used to lie, warily buried in bed when Gregor left on a business trip, who greeted him on his return in the evening, sitting in his bathrobe in the armchair, who actually had difficulty getting to his feet but as a sign of joy only lifted up his arms, and who, on the rare occasions when the whole family went out for a walk, on a few Sundays in June and on the major holidays, used to shuffle along with great effort between Gregor and his mother, who were slow walkers themselves, always a little more slowly than they were, wrapped in his old overcoat, always carefully planting down his crutch-handled cane, and when he wanted to say something, nearly always stood still and assembled his escort around him. Now, however, he was holding himself very erect, dressed in a tight-fitting blue uniform with gold buttons, the kind worn by messengers at banking concerns. Above the high, stiff collar of the jacket, his heavy chin protruded. Under his bushy eyebrows, his black eyes darted bright, piercing glances. His usually rumpled white hair was combed flat, with a scrupulously exact, gleaming part. He threw his cap, which was adorned with a gold monogram, probably that of a bank, in an arc across the entire room onto the couch, and with the tails of his long uniform jacket slapped back, his hands in his pants pocket, went for Gregor with a sullen look on his face. He probably did not know himself what he had in mind. Still, he lifted his unusually high feet off the floor, and Gregor staggered at the gigantic size of the soles of his boots. But he didn't linger over this. He knew right from the first day of his new life that his father considered only the strictest treatment called for in dealing with him. And so he ran ahead of his father, stopped when his father stood still, and scooted ahead again when his father made even the slightest movement. In this way, they made more than one tour of the room without anything decisive happening. In fact, the whole movement didn't have the appearance of a chase because of its slow tempo. So Gregor kept to the floor for the time being, especially since he was afraid that his father might interpret a flight onto the walls or the ceilings as a piece of particular nastiness. Of course, Gregor had to admit that he would not be able to keep up this running for long. For whenever his father took one step, Gregor had to execute countless movements. He was already beginning to feel winded. Just as in the old days, he had not very reliable lungs. As he now staggered around, hardly keeping his eyes open in order to gather all his strength for the running. In his obtuseness, not thinking of any escape other than by running, and having almost forgotten that the walls were at his disposal, though here, of course, they were blocked up with elaborately carved furniture full of notches and points. At that moment, a lightly flung object hit the floor right near him and rolled in front of him. It was an apple. A second one came flying right after it. Gregor stopped dead with fear. Further running was useless, for his father was determined to bombard him. He had filled his pockets from the fruit bowl on the buffet, and was now pitching one apple after another, for the time being with taking good aim. These little red apples rolled around on the floor as if electrified, clicking into each other. One apple, thrown weakly, grazed Gregor's back and slid off harmlessly. But the very next one that came flying after it literally forced its way into Gregor's back. Gregor tried to drag himself away, as if the startling, unbelievable pain might disappear with a change of pace. But he felt nailed to the spot and stretched out his body in a complete confusion of all his senses. With his last glance, he saw the door of his room burst open as his mother rushed out ahead of his screaming sister in her chemise, for his sister had partly undressed her while she was unconscious in order to let her breathe more freely. He saw his mother run up to his father, and on the way, her unfastened petticoats slide to the floor one by one, and saw as, stumbling over the skirts, she forced herself onto his father and embracing him in complete union with him. But now, Gregor's sight went dim. Her hands clasping his father's neck, begged for Gregor's life.